The courthouse steps had never felt so steep. Reuben Hunter stood at the bottom of them on a Tuesday morning in the summer of 1882, his boots planted in the red dust of Caldwell, Kansas, his hat pushed back on his head, and his voice carrying like a rifle shot across the gathered crowd. He held a bundle of letters above his head, tied with a faded blue ribbon, and every man and woman in that square knew those letters could either save Wilhelmina Wallace or destroy her completely. "I am her witness," Reuben said, and his voice did not shake, though everything inside him was shaking like a cottonwood in a thunderstorm. "And I have the letters." The crowd parted. Judge Harold Price appeared in the courthouse doorway, his black robe billowing around him like a storm cloud gathering before a lightning strike. Behind him, in the shadows of that tall stone building, stood Franklin Doyle, the man who had put Wilhelmina in chains, the man who had told the court she was a thief, a fraud, a woman without honor, and the smug satisfaction on Franklin Doyle's face evaporated the moment he saw what Reuben held in his hand. "You have no standing here," Doyle said, his voice a controlled hiss that barely made it down the steps. "I have every letter she ever wrote to me," Reuben said, louder now, not just for the judge but for every soul in Caldwell who had whispered about Wilhelmina Wallace over the past 3 weeks. "And every letter she wrote to her brother, and every letter she wrote to the land office in Wichita. I have proof that this woman never stole a single acre of land. I have proof that she was the rightful owner of the Crooked Creek property all along. And I have proof, Your Honor, that the man you should be trying today is standing right behind you wearing a suit that cost more than most men in this town earn in a year." A murmur rolled through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Inside the courthouse, behind a closed oak door, Wilhelmina Wallace sat with her wrists resting on a rough wooden table, iron shackles on both hands, her dark hair pinned but beginning to fall loose around her face, and she could not hear what was happening outside. What she could hear was the silence of a room that had been deliberating her fate for 3 days. What she could feel was the cold certainty that she was alone. She did not know about the letters. She did not know that Reuben Hunter had ridden through the night to bring them here. She did not know that the man she had tried to forget for the better part of 2 years, the man she had convinced herself was too proud, too stubborn, and too dangerous to love, had just put everything he owned and everything he was on the line for her. But to understand what those letters meant, and what it cost Reuben Hunter to stand on those courthouse steps, you have to go back to the beginning of the thing. You have to go back 18 months, to a cold March afternoon when Wilhelmina Wallace first arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, with 2 leather trunks, a surveying map, and a heart full of grief she was not ready to show anyone. The Santa Fe Railroad had brought her as far as it was going to, which was as far as she needed to go. Wilhelmina stepped off the train at Caldwell's small depot and stood for a moment in the wind, which was sharp and thin and smelled of dust and coming rain. She was 26 years old, which was older than the town sometimes treated unmarried women, and she had the kind of composure that came not from ease but from having survived considerable hardship. She had dark brown eyes and a straight-backed, measured way of moving that made strangers underestimate how much she was taking in at any given moment. She was taking in quite a lot. She was also taking in the fact that the man who was supposed to meet her here, her brother Daniel Wallace, who had preceded her by 8 months and was by now supposedly the owner of one of the best quarter sections along Crooked Creek, was not on the platform. He was not on the platform, and he was not inside the depot, and when she asked the station master if a Daniel Wallace had left any message for a Miss Wilhelmina Wallace, the station master looked at her with a kind of pity that she found immediately alarming. "Ma'am," the station master said, "Daniel Wallace passed away this last January. Fever took him. I am sorry to be the one to tell you." Wilhelmina stood very still for a moment. Then she picked up her smaller trunk herself, because no one had moved to help her, and she asked where she might find a boarding house. She did not cry. She had cried enough on the train, because something in her had known. Something in her had known since Daniel's last letter had arrived late, and without its usual cheerful detail, the sentences short and blunt and ending in a way that felt like a man trying to put down something heavy before it crushed him. She had told herself she was imagining it. She had been wrong. The boarding house was run by a widow named Clara Marsh, who was 60 and broad-shouldered and made the best biscuits in Sumner County. She gave Wilhelmina a room on the second floor that looked out over the main street, and she charged a fair rate and asked very few questions, which Wilhelmina appreciated more than she could say. That first evening, sitting at the small desk in her room with a single candle burning, Wilhelmina spread out her brother's papers. He had written to her faithfully all through the previous summer and fall, and she had kept every letter. He had described the land in loving detail, the way Crooked Creek bent around the eastern edge of the property, the stand of cottonwoods that provided shade in the afternoon, the good grass and the modest sod house he had built himself, plank by plank. He had registered the land through the Wichita Land Office under his own name, but had included a note in one of his letters saying that, in the event of his death, he wanted the land to pass to Wilhelmina. The problem was that a note in a private letter was not the same as a legal will, and Wilhelmina was not Daniel's widow. She was his sister, which meant the law was going to be complicated about this. She had already known it would be complicated, which was why she had hired an attorney in St. Louis before she left. The attorney had told her to go to Caldwell, present her brother's letters at the land office, and apply for formal transfer of the deed. It was not guaranteed, but it was her best case. What the attorney had not told her, because he did not know, was that another man had already filed a competing claim on the Crooked Creek property. That man's name was Franklin Doyle. Reuben Hunter's ranch, the Double H, sat 5 miles north of the Crooked Creek property, which meant he was not a close neighbor exactly, but he was close enough to know the land and to know that Daniel Wallace had worked it honestly and well, and close enough to have noticed when Daniel Wallace's fever left him so weak in early January that he couldn't make it to the well. Reuben had been the one to bring Daniel water. He had been the one to ride to town for the doctor. He had been there when Daniel, pale and burning on his narrow cot, had pressed a sealed envelope into his hands and said, "If I don't make it through this, you get this to my sister Mina. She's coming in March. She needs to know about the deed." Daniel had not made it through. Reuben had held onto the envelope because he had not known how to reach Wilhelmina Wallace in St. Louis. He had asked around about her and got no useful answers. And then, in the thick of calving season and the brutal late winter storms that followed, he had put the envelope in the lockbox where he kept important papers and told himself he would figure it out when the weather broke. He was figuring it out when Wilhelmina Wallace walked into the Caldwell General Store in the 3rd week of March, surveying map under her arm, with the focused expression of a woman who had not come here to be deterred. Reuben was behind her in line at the counter, buying wire and salt. He was a big man, 31 years old, with the kind of weathered, deliberate physical presence that came from spending most of his life outdoors, and most of that time working harder than was strictly comfortable. He had honest brown eyes, a strong jaw that he did not always remember to shave, and hands that were rough and steady and capable of great gentleness when the situation called for it, which he rarely showed to strangers. He heard her ask the storekeeper about the land office and about the transfer of a property deed. He heard her mention Crooked Creek. He felt something tighten in his chest. "Excuse me," he said, before he had quite decided to say it. She turned around and looked at him with those dark brown eyes and the kind of evaluating steadiness that made it clear she was not going to be easily impressed or easily frightened. "You are Daniel Wallace's sister," he said. It was not a question. Something shifted in her face. Not pain exactly, a bracing for it. "I am. Were you acquainted with my brother?" "I was," Reuben said. "My name is Reuben Hunter. I have something for you. An envelope he asked me to deliver." He watched the composure in her face hold and then, very briefly, almost invisibly, soften. "I see," she said, and then more quietly, "he trusted you with it." "He did," Reuben said. And I should have gotten it to you sooner. I'm sorry about that." She studied him for a moment longer than was comfortable. "When can I have it?" "I have it at my ranch," he said. "I can ride it out to you tomorrow if you'll tell me where you're staying." "I'll come to your ranch," she said immediately. "I would rather come to the place where my brother spent his last weeks, if that is acceptable." Reuben said it was acceptable, and gave her directions, and tried not to think too much about the fact that he had been a little unsteady on his feet for the past 30 seconds. She arrived at the Double H the next morning at 10 o'clock, riding a hired horse with considerably more confidence than most women who had never ridden much in their lives. She sat straight and did not make conversation, and he led her around the property and showed her where the fence line met Daniel's, and told her everything he could remember about her brother's last weeks, which was not enough. And he knew it was not enough, and he could see her working to keep her face composed throughout. He gave her the envelope. She read it sitting at his kitchen table while he made coffee, which felt odd but also strangely natural. The envelope contained a handwritten addendum to the land deed, witnessed by Reuben Hunter and a neighboring farmer named Amos Cole, in which Daniel Wallace formally transferred the Crooked Creek property to his sister Wilhelmina Wallace of St. Louis, Missouri. Daniel had been thorough, even dying. That was something Wilhelmina could not keep entirely from her face, and she pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth and looked at the far wall while she recovered. "He thought of everything," she said finally. "He was a careful man," Reuben said. "He was," she agreed. She looked at the document again. "This is what I need for the land office." "It should be," Reuben said. "I signed it as witness. Amos Cole signed it. 2 witnesses is what the law requires." What neither of them knew yet was that Franklin Doyle had already spoken to a clerk at the Wichita land office. He had already offered a significant sum of money, not as a bribe, technically, but as a fee for expedited processing. And the clerk had already filed Doyle's competing claim with a date stamp that predated Daniel Wallace's formal registration by 2 days. It was not exactly fraud, but it was the kind of slippery, calculated manipulation that men like Franklin Doyle were very good at. Franklin Doyle owned the largest cattle operation in Sumner County. He was 48 years old, gray-haired, and publicly respected. He was also the kind of man who saw a woman arriving alone to claim disputed land as an opportunity rather than a complication. Reuben Hunter and Franklin Doyle had a history that was not openly discussed, but that everyone in Caldwell understood. 2 years earlier, Doyle had tried to buy a water rights corridor that bordered the Double H's southern pasture. Reuben had refused to sell because the corridor fed the primary watering hole for his cattle, and without it, his operation would be mortally compromised within a single dry season. Doyle had tried to pressure him through the bank, which held the note on Reuben's land. Reuben had paid the note off 6 months early, using every spare dollar he had, and Doyle had not spoken to him since. Wilhelmina did not know any of this when she presented Daniel's deed addendum to the Caldwell land office on a Monday morning in late March. She discovered it when the land agent, a nervous young man named Holt, told her with visible discomfort that a competing claim had been filed by Franklin Doyle in February, and that the matter would need to go before a judge. Wilhelmina stood at the counter and felt the kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature. "My brother filed his claim through this very office last summer," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Yes, ma'am. But Mr. Doyle's claim, there are irregularities in the original filing. The judge will have to sort it out." She left the land office and stood on the street and breathed the sharp spring air. Then she went back to Clara Marsh's boarding house and sat at her desk and began writing letters. She wrote to the land office in Wichita. She wrote to the attorney in St. Louis. She wrote to every official she could identify who might have jurisdiction over a disputed land claim in Sumner County, Kansas, in the year 1882. And then, because she did not know many people in Caldwell, and because something in her had already identified Reuben Hunter as a man she could trust, she wrote to him. She told him what had happened. She told him she intended to fight it. She asked if he would be willing to formally testify as witness to the deed addendum he had signed. Reuben received her letter at the Double H on a Thursday. He read it at the kitchen table where she had read her brother's letter, and he felt a familiar tightening in his chest that he recognized now as something specific. Not just concern, not just principle, though there was plenty of that. Something warmer and more complicated that he was not ready to name. He wrote back immediately. He would testify. He had no doubt about the legitimacy of Daniel's deed. He would do whatever the court required. What followed was 2 months of legal correspondence, land office hearings, and mounting tension, during which Reuben Hunter and Wilhelmina Wallace saw each other approximately twice a week. Sometimes she came to his ranch because she wanted to ask him about a detail of the deed or a technical aspect of the land. Sometimes he rode to Caldwell on business that happened to align with business that she had in town. They had lunch at the restaurant on Main Street 4 times. They walked along the edge of Crooked Creek once in late April when the cottonwood seeds were drifting through the air like a strange summer snow, and she stood at the bank of the creek and looked at the land that had cost her brother his health and then his life, and said quietly that she intended to make something good of it. "You will," Reuben said. She looked at him sideways. "You are a very certain person." "About some things," he said. "What things?" He thought about that. "About land," he said. "About cattle." "About character," she held his gaze. "And which of those am I?" He felt something rise in him that he pressed back down carefully, because she was in a legal fight and she was grieving, and she did not need the complication of knowing that he was increasingly unable to think about anything except her. "Character," he said, clearly. Something almost like a smile crossed her face. Something that did not quite land as a smile, but that was better because it was genuine. "Thank you," she said. "That is not a small thing coming from you." They stood by the creek for a while longer, not speaking, and it was not uncomfortable. It was, Reuben thought, the most comfortable silence he had been inside in years, which told him something he was not quite ready to deal with. The legal proceedings dragged through May and into June. Doyle's attorneys were sharp and expensive, and they raised objections at every turn. They questioned the validity of the witnessed addendum. They suggested that Reuben Hunter, as a man with known antipathy toward Franklin Doyle, had a personal motive to commit fraud on a grieving woman's behalf. They submitted a document from a handwriting expert who testified on paper that Daniel Wallace's signature on the addendum showed signs of duress or possible forgery. Wilhelmina was in the land office when she heard that last accusation, and the fury that crossed her face was cold and absolute and considerably more frightening than hot anger would have been. "That is a lie," she said, with perfect control. "My brother wrote that document in his own hand. The man you have hired has been paid to say otherwise." The land agent Holt would not look at her. She left the office and walked 3 blocks and found herself standing outside the feed store where Reuben was loading wire onto his wagon, and when he saw her face, he set down the wire and came to her immediately. "What happened?" he said. She told him, and he stood listening with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and then he said something she had not expected. "Amos Cole died in April," he said. "Fever, he was the other witness. Without him they'll try to make it just my word against Doyle's hired expert." The silence between them was different now, heavier. "Do you have any of my brother's letters?" she asked. "Anything in his writing that I could use to show the expert was wrong about the signature?" "I don't," Reuben said slowly. "But you might." She stared at him. "You said you kept his letters," Reuben said. "You have 2 years' worth of letters in his handwriting." A genuine expert could compare them to the deed addendum and prove the signature is legitimate. Wilhelmina's breath came out slowly. "The letters are in St. Louis," she said, "at my mother's house. I did not bring them because I did not think I would need them." "Write to your mother tonight," Reuben said. "Get them sent out on the fastest available post. I'll write to the court and ask for a continuance." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not fully read. There was gratitude in it and something else, something that made his pulse do something inconvenient. "You know," she said quietly, Most men in your position would have stayed out of this a long time ago." "My position," he said. "A man who doesn't want the complications," she said. "A man with a working ranch and no particular reason to get himself tangled in someone else's lawsuit." "I signed that document," Reuben said. "What happens to it happens to my word." "Is that the only reason?" He met her eyes, and the thing he had been carefully not naming between them was suddenly a great deal more present than he had been managing. "No," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked away down the street, and there was color in her face that had not been there before. "I will write to my mother tonight," she said. It took 3 weeks for the letters to arrive from St. Louis. 3 weeks during which Reuben found reasons to ride into Caldwell more often than his ranch strictly required, and during which Wilhelmina walked out to the Double H on 2 separate Saturday afternoons and helped with the mending of fence on the south pasture because, she said, she needed something physical to do while she was waiting and she did not much care for embroidery. She was good with a fence post hammer. He told her so. She said that her father had worked a farm in Missouri and she had grown up doing real work, and she did not see any reason to pretend otherwise. She met his 3 ranch hands who were named Pete and Lucas and a man called Big Court, and they were all clearly charmed by her and slightly afraid of her in equal measure, which Reuben found deeply amusing. On the second Saturday, while they were walking back from the south pasture in the late afternoon light, she said suddenly, "Tell me about Franklin Doyle. Tell me everything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her. He told her about the water rights corridor and the bank note, and the 2 years of Cold War that had passed between them. He told her that Doyle was a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted and who had enough money and enough influence in Sumner County to make the getting fairly easy most of the time. "And the Crooked Creek property," she said. "Why does he want it?" "The creek," Reuben said. "Same reason he wanted my water corridor. He's expanding his cattle operation west, and he needs reliable water access. Crooked Creek is the most consistent water source on that stretch of land. In a dry year, whoever controls it controls the difference between a herd that makes it and one that doesn't." Wilhelmina was quiet for a moment. "So this isn't really about my brother's deed at all," she said. "It never was. It's about the water. It's always about water out here," Reuben said. "And the people," she said, with a particular edge in her voice, "are just obstacles. To men like Doyle," he said. "Yes." She stopped walking and turned to face him, and the setting sun behind her was doing remarkable things to the light, and he was standing somewhat closer than he had intended to be. "You are not like him," she said. "I try not to be," he said. "You are nothing like him," she said, and there was a certainty in it that was not flattery but something quieter and more considered, and it went through him like a plucked string. They were standing 6 inches apart, and the evening was very still, and he was about to say something he had been building toward for weeks, when Pete appeared over the fence ridge hollering about a steer that had gotten into the creek bed and needed pulling out, and the moment dissolved completely. Reuben went to deal with the steer. Wilhelmina walked back to the ranch house and waited for him. When he came in, muddy to the knee and clearly somewhat frustrated, she had made coffee and there were 2 cups on the table, and she was sitting at the table reading one of his almanacs like she lived there. The domestic simplicity of it hit him square in the chest. "Thank you," he said, reaching for the coffee. "You have a very well-organized kitchen," she said, not looking up. "I live alone," he said. "Organization keeps you sane." She looked up then, and there was something in her expression that was open in a way it usually wasn't. "I have been living alone since I was 23, she said. "My mother moved in with my aunt in St. Louis after my father died and my brother came west. I had a position as a bookkeeper. I lived alone in 2 rooms near the river." She paused. "I was not entirely unhappy, but it was very quiet." "Was that why you came west?" he asked. "When your brother died, you could have gone to your mother." She considered this. "I came because this land is what my brother built," she said. "It is the last thing he made. I'm not going to let a man like Franklin Doyle take it and put cattle on it and forget that Daniel Wallace ever existed." Her voice was steady, but her hands around the coffee cup were very still in a way that meant they were being held still deliberately. And because I did not want quiet anymore, I wanted something of my own, something real. He understood that completely. He understood it in his bones. He said very carefully, "I hope you find it here." She met his eyes. "I think I am beginning to," she said. The letters arrived from St. Louis in the first week of July, a bundle of 37 pieces of correspondence, all in Daniel Wallace's handwriting, spanning 2 years. Wilhelmina unwrapped them in Clara Marsh's front parlor with Reuben present, and she went through them one by one with the precision of a woman cataloging evidence, which was exactly what she was doing. Clara made tea and sat in the corner knitting and pretending not to watch them, which she absolutely was. The letters were everything they needed. Daniel's handwriting was distinctive and consistent, and when compared to the deed addendum by a legitimate examiner from Wichita, a man named Professor Aldridge who specialized in document authentication and had no connection to either party, the verdict was unambiguous. The signature on the deed was genuine. The addendum was valid. Daniel Wallace had been of sound mind and had clearly intended his sister to inherit the land. For a brief, beautiful week, Wilhelmina allowed herself to believe it was over. Then Franklin Doyle changed his strategy entirely. He had been losing the document argument, so he pivoted. He filed a new affidavit with the courthouse, this time claiming not that the deed was forged, but that Wilhelmina Wallace was not legally competent to hold property. His attorneys dug up a legal technicality from an older Kansas statute regarding unmarried women and property rights, and while the statute was widely understood to be outdated and rarely enforced, it had never been formally struck from the books, which meant it could theoretically be invoked. He also, and this was the part that made Reuben's jaw tighten like a vice, introduced testimony from 2 men drifters he had clearly paid, who claimed that Wilhelmina had represented herself as Daniel Wallace's widow to the land office, not his sister. If that were true, it would void her claim entirely and might expose her to charges of fraud. The accusation was a lie, a complete, calculated, vicious lie. But lies, Reuben knew, had a way of becoming very complicated when they reached a courtroom with the wrong judge. The wrong judge, in this case, being Harold Price, who had been the recipient of several significant campaign contributions from Franklin Doyle's political allies over the previous 4 years. Reuben found out about the new charges on a Wednesday morning when he rode into Caldwell for supplies, and Pete Marsh from the hardware store caught him at the door with a grim expression and a folded copy of the court filing. Reuben read it standing on the sidewalk, and by the time he got to the fraud allegation, his whole body had gone to stone. He went straight to Clara Marsh's boarding house. Wilhelmina met him at the door, and he could see from her face that she had already heard. She was white around the mouth and her eyes were very bright, and she stepped back to let him in. "They are going to arrest me," she said before he could speak. "They may try," he said. "No," she said with terrible precision. "They are going to arrest me. Judge Price has already signed the order. Holt told me not an hour ago. They are sending a marshal this afternoon." The silence in Clara Marsh's front hallway was very dense. "Where are the letters?" Reuben asked. She looked at him. "The letters from my brother." "The ones from St. Louis, where are they?" "In my room," she said, "in the smaller trunk." "Give them to me," he said. She stared. "Why?" "Because if they are in your possession when they arrest you," he said, "Doyle's attorneys will claim them as evidence and they will disappear. I have seen him do it before. Not to this degree, but I have seen him make evidence disappear from the records." Wilhelmina's eyes were very steady. "You would keep them safe." "I would keep them safe," he said, "and I would use them. I will go to Wichita if I have to. I will go to the territorial governor's office. I will—" He stopped. He started again, quieter. "I am not going to let this happen to you." Something broke open very slightly in her expression. Not collapse, she was not the collapsing kind. But something true, something that had been very carefully held, came to the surface briefly. "Reuben," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He stepped forward without meaning to and took her hands in both of his, which were large and rough and warm, and she held on very tightly and looked up at him with the expression of someone who has been alone with something heavy for a very long time and is just briefly setting it down. "Give me the letters," he said gently. She gave him the letters. She was arrested that afternoon by a deputy marshal named Croft, who had the grace to look embarrassed about it. She was brought to the courthouse and held in a back room while the formal charges were processed. Clara Marsh came to the courthouse immediately and sat outside the door, and everyone in Caldwell knew that Clara Marsh had opinions about anyone who bothered the women who stayed in her house, and nobody moved her. Reuben rode to Wichita that same evening. He rode through the night, which was warm and full of stars and deeply silent except for the sound of his horse's hooves on the packed road, and he thought about Wilhelmina the whole way. He thought about her hands in his, and the way she had said his name, and the way she had looked at him in the late afternoon light with something real and open in her eyes. He thought about what it would mean to build something together if she stayed, if she wanted to stay. He thought about the fact that she was in chains right now because a man like Franklin Doyle could not stand to lose a water source to a woman from St. Louis who had done nothing wrong. He rode faster. In Wichita, at first light, he found the Regional Land Records office and spent 4 hours going through the original filings on Crooked Creek. He was looking for the anomaly in Doyle's competing claim. The thing that would prove the February date stamp had been fraudulently applied, and he found it, though it took most of the morning and the sharp eyes of a records clerk named Margaret Holloway, who was clearly competent and clearly underpaid, and who seemed to take personal offense at the manipulation of her office's records. The anomaly was this. Doyle's February claim had been filed using a standard form that the Wichita Land Office had not adopted until March. The form number on the document corresponded to a revision that had been implemented after Doyle's alleged filing date. It was a small, bureaucratic detail, the kind of thing that slipped past everyone in the chaos of competing claims and busy offices, but it meant that the February date stamp was impossible. Doyle's claim had been filed no earlier than March, which meant it post-dated Daniel Wallace's original summer filing by nearly 9 months. The whole competing claim was fraudulent, not just irregular, fraudulent. Margaret Holloway made certified copies of the relevant forms and the comparison documentation with an efficiency that suggested she had been waiting for someone to notice this for some time. She stamped and signed the copies and handed them to Reuben with an expression of grim satisfaction. "You take care of this," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Reuben said. He rode back through the night. The trial of Wilhelmina Wallace on charges of fraudulent property representation was set for the following Tuesday. Reuben arrived back in Caldwell on Sunday morning, barely 2 days ahead of the trial, having slept approximately 4 hours over the previous 3 days. He smelled like horse and road and exhaustion. He stopped at Clara Marsh's first, because he needed to tell her what he had found, but Wilhelmina was still being held at the courthouse, which was technically an outrage, and he went there next. They let him see her in the back room for 20 minutes with a deputy sitting in the corner. She looked tired but intact. She had refused to let herself fall apart, which was very like her. When he came through the door, she rose from her chair and her eyes searched his face immediately. "Did you find it?" she said. "I found it," he said. The thing that moved across her face was not simple relief. It was something larger and more complex, the releasing of a held breath that had been held for weeks and months, the slow lowering of an armor that had been necessary and costly. "Tell me," she said. He sat across from her and told her everything, keeping his voice low and even with the deputy in the corner. He told her about the form numbers and Margaret Holloway and the certified copies now in his saddlebag. He told her that the competing claim was a fraud, provably and documentably so, and that he was going to stand on those courthouse steps tomorrow morning and make sure that every person in Caldwell knew it before the trial even began. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said nothing for a moment. "You rode to Wichita," she said finally. "Yes, and back. Yes, through the night. Both ways," he said. She looked at him with an expression that he had no precedent for, something enormous and careful and entirely serious. "Why?" she said. It was not a challenge. It was a genuine question, and it was asking for more than the obvious answer. He met her eyes, and he was tired enough that the careful management he usually maintained over what he let himself express had slipped considerably. "You know why," he said. The deputy in the corner was very pointedly examining his boots. "Say it," Wilhelmina said quietly. "Because I love you," Reuben said. "And I am not interested in a version of Caldwell, Kansas, or any other place where you are in chains and Franklin Doyle is walking around free. So I went to Wichita." She was very still for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, which was still rough and still warm and now also trembling slightly from exhaustion, and she said, "I love you too. I have been trying not to for 6 months, and I would like to stop trying now." He turned his hand over and held hers. The deputy, to his eternal credit, did not look up. Tuesday came. The main street of Caldwell was lined with people at 8 o'clock in the morning, because word had gotten around that there was going to be something worth watching. Clara Marsh was there with her arms folded, and her expression communicating what she thought of men who put innocent women in courtrooms. The storekeeper had closed his shop for the morning. Margaret from the milliner's was whispering to the blacksmith's wife. Even the sheriff, who had studiously avoided taking sides, was standing on the edge of the crowd, with the look of a man waiting to see which way the wind was going to blow. Reuben Hunter stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps with the letters and the certified land office documents held in his hand. He had slept 6 hours and washed at the pump and put on his good shirt, and he stood straight and solid and absolutely immovable. Judge Price appeared in the courthouse doorway, and behind him Franklin Doyle, and Reuben let them both see what he was holding before he said a word. Then he said it. "I am her witness," he said, "and I have the letters." And then he said everything else. He said it loudly enough that the whole square could hear. He explained the fraudulent date stamp on Doyle's competing claim. He held up the certified copies from the Wichita Land Office and named Margaret Holloway as the records clerk who had identified the irregularity. He produced Daniel Wallace's letters, all 37 of them, and stated that they constituted additional proof of the legitimate ownership chain. He stated that Wilhelmina Wallace had never misrepresented herself to any official body, that she was Daniel Wallace's sister as she had always claimed to be, and that the 2 men who had testified otherwise were paid witnesses whose identities he was prepared to present to the court. He also said, calmly and clearly and looking directly at Franklin Doyle, that the fraudulent filing of a competing land claim was a criminal offense in the state of Kansas, and that he would be filing a formal complaint with the Attorney General's office in Topeka unless the charges against Wilhelmina Wallace were dropped by noon. Franklin Doyle's face had gone through several colors during this speech. It was now a shade that Reuben found privately satisfying. Judge Price looked at the certified documents, he looked at the crowd, he looked at Franklin Doyle. Franklin Doyle's attorney stepped forward and murmured something in the judge's ear. The judge murmured something back. Another murmur was exchanged. Reuben waited. Judge Price straightened up. He had the look of a man who had just been informed that the foundation of the building he was standing in was cracked, and who was deciding whether to run or pretend he hadn't heard. He was a political man, ultimately, and political men knew when something had become too visible to be manageable. "The charges against Miss Wallace," he said, loudly and without particular grace, "are withdrawn pending review of new evidence." The murmur in the crowd became a sound. Clara Marsh made a noise of comprehensive satisfaction. Reuben did not look away from the courthouse door. 2 minutes later, the deputy marshal brought Wilhelmina out. She walked down the courthouse steps in the morning sunlight with her dark hair loose around her shoulders and her wrists bearing the red marks from the shackles, and she was the most beautiful and most formidable person Reuben had ever seen in his life. She came down the steps and stopped in front of him. He held out the letters. She took them from him with both hands and held them against her chest and looked up at him, and the sunlight was very clear and the crowd was pressing in around them, and he did not care about any of it. "You said everything," she said. "I said what needed saying," he said, "in front of everyone." "That was rather the point," he said. She looked at the letters in her hands. She looked at him. "You said you love me," she said, "in the back room on Sunday." "I did," he said. "You may want to consider," she said, and there was something happening at the corner of her mouth, "whether standing on courthouse steps making declarations in front of the whole town is a reasonable way to pursue a courtship." "I don't know that I was thinking about the courtship," he said. "I was thinking about getting you out." "And now," she said, "what are you thinking about now?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I am thinking," he said, "that I would like to sit down somewhere quiet and drink coffee and not be in a crowd, and that I would like you to be there." She exhaled, and it was a sound he had not heard from her before, the sound of genuine relief and something softer underneath it. "Yes," she said, "I would like that too." The formal charges were reviewed by a circuit court attorney the following week, and the conclusion was exactly what Reuben had presented. Doyle's competing claim was fraudulent, the date stamp was manipulated, and Wilhelmina Wallace was the rightful owner of the Crooked Creek property. The deed was formally transferred to her name on a Friday afternoon in July, 7 months after she had arrived in Caldwell with 2 leather trunks and a surveying map and a heart full of grief. Franklin Doyle did not have a good August. The Attorney General's office in Topeka took a formal interest in the fraudulent land claim, and the land agent Holt, who had been the instrument of the date stamp manipulation, cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced penalty, which meant Doyle's involvement was documented fully. He was not sent to prison because he was rich and had lawyers, but he was fined substantially, publicly humiliated, and removed from 2 civic committees that he had valued highly. The 2 paid witnesses were charged with perjury. Doyle's political influence in Sumner County diminished rapidly after that, in the way that influence does when it is built on a foundation that turns out to be rotten. Margaret Holloway, the records clerk in Wichita, received a commendation from the land office for her role in identifying the fraudulent filing. She was also, within the year, promoted to deputy land registrar, which Reuben later told Wilhelmina was the most satisfying part of the whole business. Wilhelmina moved to the Crooked Creek property in August. She hired 2 men to help her expand Daniel's sod house into something more livable, and she ordered lumber from the mill in Caldwell and new window glass from the general store. And by September, she had a proper house with a kitchen garden starting and the creek running along the eastern edge of her land as it always had. Reuben came to help with the roof when the lumber arrived. He brought Pete and Lucas and Big Court, who worked 2 full days on the roof, and accepted Wilhelmina's cooking as payment, which they were enthusiastic about. Big Court told Reuben afterward that it was the best meal he had eaten in 2 years, and Reuben told him to keep that observation to himself, because he did not need his ranch hands organizing around his domestic situation. He came back on Saturday mornings to help with whatever needed doing, fencing, primarily, and there was always fencing. Wilhelmina had strong opinions about fencing. She had studied up on it, which was very like her, and she knew which posts and which wire gauges were appropriate for each section of her land. They worked well together. They had always worked well together, but now there was the additional element of knowing what had been said and what it meant, and that awareness between them was a warm, continuous current that ran underneath everything else. He asked her to marry him in October, standing at the edge of the cottonwood grove where the creek bent east, on a cool afternoon when the leaves were going gold and the air smelled of autumn and wood smoke. He did not have a ring yet because the ring was coming from a jeweler in Wichita and had not arrived, but he felt that if he waited for the ring he would have to wait for something else, and he was done waiting. "I know the timing is perhaps not what a woman would prefer," he said, "given that you have just gotten your land and your independence and your life properly in order, and the last thing you may want is—" "Yes," she said. He stopped. "Yes, yes," she said again. "I have been waiting for you to ask since August, Reuben. You are a very deliberate person." "I wanted to be sure," he said. "Of what? Of me?" "Of myself," he said. "I wanted to be sure I could be what you need." She looked at him with that directness that had undone him from the first. "What I need," she said, "is someone who rides to Wichita in the middle of the night and stands on courthouse steps and tells the truth in front of everyone without being asked to. I have that. I have had it for months." He was a man of few words generally, which was part of why the courthouse steps had been such an event, but he found that what he wanted to say in this moment was both simple and enough. "I love you," he said. "That is the whole of it. I love you and I want to make a life with you." She stepped close to him and put her hand on his chest, over his heart, and he covered her hand with his. "I love you too," she said. "I stopped trying not to in July. It was a significant relief." He laughed, which he did not do often enough, and she laughed too, and the cottonwood leaves turned in the October air around them. The ring arrived from Wichita 10 days later. It was a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone, because he had asked the jeweler what a woman like Wilhelmina Wallace might want, and the jeweler had said that some women wanted diamonds, and some wanted something that looked like the country they lived in, and Reuben had thought he knew which kind she was. He had been right. She looked at the turquoise for a long moment and then at him with very bright eyes. "It is perfect," she said. They were married in November at the Caldwell Community Church, which was small and wooden and smelled of candle wax and pine. Clara Marsh cried, which she denied afterward. Pete and Lucas and Big Court were there, cleaned up impressively, and sat in the front row with the collective air of men who were very invested in the outcome. Margaret Holloway came down from Wichita because Reuben had written to her about the wedding, and she had apparently decided this was an event she was not going to miss. And she sat next to Clara Marsh, and they spoke quietly through the whole ceremony in a way that suggested a strong mutual agreement about many things. The minister's name was Reverend Garfield, and he was a sensible man who kept the ceremony brief, because he could tell the principals were not interested in lengthy ecclesiastical performance. He married them in 20 minutes, and when the minister said what he needed to say and looked at Reuben, Reuben said, "I do," with the quiet completeness of a man stating a fact he has known for a long time. And when Wilhelmina said it, her voice was clear and unhesitating, and she was looking directly at Reuben as if nothing else in the room existed. The reception was at Clara Marsh's boarding house, because it was the biggest space available, and Clara had spent 3 days cooking for it, which she claimed was not a special effort, but which produced an extraordinary quantity of food. There was music, a fiddler named Jackson who played dance tunes, and there was dancing in the parlor with the furniture moved back, and Reuben Hunter, who had not danced in years, danced with his wife until the fiddler's arm gave out, and he was not apologetic about it. They spent the first 2 years of their marriage making both properties work. The Crooked Creek property, with its reliable water source, turned out to be an excellent complement to the Double H's grazing land, and they combined their operations carefully and practically. Wilhelmina managed the books for both properties with the precision that had made her a good bookkeeper in St. Louis, and that made her, Reuben discovered, an extremely effective ranch manager. She had opinions about cattle pricing and grass rotation, and when to sell and when to hold, and the opinions were generally right, which meant that within 2 years the combined operation was more profitable than either property had been independently. She also planted Daniel's cottonwood grove out properly, filling in the gaps with new saplings so that the stand along the creek grew denser and more permanent. She planted a kitchen garden that expanded each year. She kept bees. She learned to shoot a rifle competently because it was a practical skill on open land, and she turned out to be a natural at it, which surprised nobody who knew her. In the spring of their second year, they had their first child, a boy. They named him Daniel. He arrived in April, red-faced and loud, and extremely opinionated about his circumstances, which Reuben observed to Wilhelmina was clearly going to be a trait. Wilhelmina, who was tired and deeply satisfied, said that there were worse things a boy could inherit than strong opinions. Daniel Wallace Hunter grew quickly and thoroughly, and had his mother's dark eyes and his father's steady temperament, and by the time he could walk he was already trying to follow Reuben around the ranch yard with an expression of intense purpose. 2 years after Daniel, they had a daughter. They named her Clara, after the woman who had sat outside a courthouse door with her arms folded, and her expression making clear to all of Sumner County that Wilhelmina Wallace had people who stood by her. Clara Marsh, when she was told, was characteristically brisk about it and clearly overwhelmed in the way that she expressed by making an enormous amount of food and bringing it to the ranch. Clara Hunter arrived in August, when the heat was absolute and the creek was low, and the cottonwoods cast long afternoon shadows across the house. She had her father's brown eyes, and it soon became clear, her mother's precise and evaluating intelligence. The Crooked Creek property, formally registered in Wilhelmina Ann Hunter's name following the marriage, flourished in the way that it had always had the potential to flourish, given water and care and the right people. The sod house Daniel had built was gone now, replaced by the proper house Wilhelmina had built in that first summer, which had been expanded twice since then to accommodate a growing family and the ongoing practicality of ranch life. The kitchen garden had a stone border now. The bees produced good honey that Wilhelmina sold in Caldwell at the general store. Reuben's first fence post from the Double H was still standing at the north boundary of the combined property, weathered silver by the sun, and he had never replaced it because Wilhelmina had told him once that she liked it there. It looked like the land had always had someone taking care of it. He thought about that sometimes. About the chain of things that led to now, Daniel's illness and the careful letter written with failing hands, the envelope in Reuben's lockbox through a long winter, the woman stepping off a train in Caldwell with 2 trunks and a surveying map, and that particular composure that was not hardness but something much more interesting. He thought about Wichita and Margaret Holloway and the form numbers and the long ride home in the dark. He thought about the courthouse steps and the crowd and the look on Doyle's face and the more important thing, which was the look on Wilhelmina's face when she came down those steps into the sunlight. 5 years after the wedding, on a Saturday in October when the cottonwoods were gold again, they rode out to the creek together on the horses, which they did most Saturdays when the children were with Pete and the work would allow it. They sat at the bank where they had stood that first spring when the seeds were drifting through the air, and watched the water go by, which it did with the quiet persistence of water that has been running the same course for longer than anyone could remember. "I want to write to Margaret Holloway," Wilhelmina said. "I have been meaning to invite her out. It has been too long." "Write to her," Reuben said. "She can stay in the guest room." "Clara Marsh would like to see her again, I think." "Clara Marsh would like to have someone to organize," Wilhelmina said with affection. "Same thing," Reuben said. She leaned back against his shoulder, which she did when they were alone and the world had momentarily agreed to be still. He put his arm around her. "Do you ever think about what this would have been," she said, "if the letters had not arrived in time, if you had not gone to Wichita?" "I think about it," he said. "Not often." "What do you think when you think about it?" He considered this honestly. "I think that I would have found another way," he said. "I would not have given up. That is not something I am capable of with you." She was quiet for a moment. The creek ran. A meadowlark called from somewhere across the water. "I wrote my mother," she said. "She is coming next spring. She wants to meet Daniel and Clara." "Good," he said. "She'll like this place." "She'll have opinions about the kitchen garden," Wilhelmina said. "You have opinions about the kitchen garden," he said. "My opinions are correct," she said without a trace of doubt. He laughed and she laughed, and the cottonwood leaves turned in the October air above them exactly as they had 5 years ago in this same spot, and it was the same and completely different and entirely right. There was a letter from the Topeka Land Office waiting at the house when they got back, official and stamped. It was formal notification that the final appeal of Franklin Doyle's case had been rejected and that the fine levied against him would stand. It was the last piece of a long legal process, and it had arrived, somewhat characteristically, at the exact moment it was no longer urgent. Wilhelmina read it at the kitchen table and set it down and said, "Good." She did not say anything else about it. She went to the stove and stirred something that smelled of herbs from the garden in the end of summer, and Reuben sat at the table and watched her move through the kitchen she had built in the house her brother had started, on the land she had fought for, in the life she had made, and he thought that this was what the thing had been for all along. Not the fight, not the courthouse steps, not Wichita and the long ride and the cold night road. Those things had been necessary, and he would do them all again without hesitation. But they had been the bridge, not the destination. The destination was this: the kitchen and the garden and the creek and the children asleep in their rooms, and the woman at the stove who had come west with 2 trunks and a surveying map and changed everything. He got up from the table and stood behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back into him with the ease of years and the warmth of certainty. And the October evening came down outside, and the cottonwoods moved in the wind, and the creek ran on as it always had and always would, indifferent and sustaining and unchanged. 3 years later, in the spring of 1890, with Caldwell grown considerably, and the frontier in slow, irreversible transformation, Wilhelmina and Reuben had their 3rd child. They named him Amos, after the man who had witnessed Daniel's deed addendum and not lived to see its vindication. Amos Cole had been a quiet, honest farmer who had done a small and crucial thing, and they thought his name deserved to be carried forward. Amos Hunter arrived in May, loud and healthy and immediately beloved by his older brother Daniel, who took his responsibilities as eldest very seriously, and installed himself as a fixture at the baby's side for the first week with an expression of intense, proprietorial care. Clara, 2 years younger than Daniel, was less interested in the baby and more interested in the new foal that had arrived the same week, which was very much her nature. Pete retired from ranching that fall, his hands too stiff for the work, and Reuben gave him a small house on the edge of the south pasture and told him it was his for as long as he wanted it. Pete said he didn't need charity, and Reuben said it wasn't charity. It was what you did for someone who had worked your land for 15 years and pulled a steer out of a creek at an inconvenient moment, and Pete could not argue with that. Lucas and Big Court stayed on. Big Court had married a woman from Caldwell named Ruth, who had strong opinions about everything and got along extremely well with Wilhelmina, and the 2 families had Sunday dinners together through most of the year with a regularity that had become one of the stable facts of both households. Wilhelmina continued writing letters. She was a committed and prolific correspondent, which was not surprising given that letters had been so central to everything that had mattered. She wrote to her mother, who visited for 3 months every spring and who had developed, contrary to expectation, a passionate enthusiasm for the Kansas prairie. She wrote to Margaret Holloway, who was now the deputy land registrar in Wichita and who was managing 3 cases of fraudulent land claims simultaneously with characteristic efficiency. She wrote to the attorney in St. Louis who had advised her when she first came west, updating him on the outcome of the case in terms that she described as professional courtesy and that Reuben suspected were also a quiet satisfaction. She wrote, sometimes, to the Topeka newspaper about land rights and property law and the persistent difficulty of women navigating a legal system that had been designed primarily around assumptions of who owned things and who did not. The letters were published with some frequency because they were well argued and clearly written and addressed something that more people were thinking about than were willing to say. Reuben read every one of them and thought, each time, that she was more impressive than anyone in Caldwell had originally given her credit for, which was most of Caldwell's problem, not hers. He told her so. "I know," she said, without false modesty, "but it is nice to hear from you." The year Daniel turned 8, he asked his father what the courthouse step story was. He had heard it mentioned in bits and pieces, at Sunday dinners and community gatherings, in the way that stories in small places become attached to the people who live them, referenced without always being told directly. He knew it involved his parents and the land and something significant that had happened before he was born. Reuben took him to the courthouse one afternoon, just the two of them, while Wilhelmina was at the land office on routine business. They stood at the bottom of the steps where Reuben had stood 9 years earlier, and Reuben told the story properly and in full. He told it about Daniel's grandfather, whose name the boy carried, and about the letters and the deed and the long night ride to Wichita and what had been at stake. Young Daniel listened with great seriousness. "Were you scared?" he asked when Reuben finished. Reuben thought about this. "Not of the crowd," he said. "Not of Doyle particularly. I was scared of failing, of not being enough." "But you were," Daniel said. "Your mother did most of it herself," Reuben said. "She kept the letters safe for years. She fought through the land office and the court proceedings for months. What I did was the last part of something she had been doing all along." Daniel considered this with the evaluating intelligence that was entirely his mother's. "But you got her out," he said. "I did," Reuben said. "Because you love her," Daniel said with the straightforward logic of an 8-year-old. "Yes," Reuben said, "because I love her." They stood on the steps for a moment. "I think," Daniel said, "that when I grow up I want to do something like that, something that is hard and matters." Reuben put his hand on his son's shoulder. "That is a good thing to want," he said. Wilhelmina found them both sitting on the courthouse steps when she came out of the land office, which she observed was possibly not the most conventional way to spend a Tuesday afternoon. Reuben said they had been having a conversation. She looked at young Daniel, who had the expression of someone who has been told something important and is organizing it carefully. "What kind of conversation?" she said. "The kind that matters," Reuben said. She looked at her husband. He looked at her. Something passed between them that was not a word and not a gesture, but was simply the current of two people who had been through something real together and were still standing on the other side of it, still choosing it, still grateful. "Well," she said, "come home. Your brother is going to put frogs in Clara's bed if we leave them alone much longer, and Big Court's Ruth is coming for dinner." Reuben stood up. Young Daniel stood up. They walked home together through the evening streets of Caldwell, which was larger now and louder, and in many ways unrecognizable from the dusty frontier town of 1882, but which still had its courthouse with its wide stone steps, and still had the memory of a summer morning when a cattleman had stood at the bottom of those steps and told the truth in front of everyone. The truth was still there. It was in the deed registered in Wilhelmina Ann Hunter's name at the Wichita Land Office. It was in the turquoise ring on her hand, worn smooth now with years. It was in the names of 3 children, Daniel and Clara and Amos, who carried pieces of the story without knowing all of it yet, though they would. It was in the way Reuben Hunter held his wife's hand as they walked through Caldwell in the October evening, which he had done on 1,000 evenings and intended to do on 1,000 more, because the courthouse steps had been necessary, and the letters had been necessary, and the long night ride had been necessary, but none of it had been the point. The point was this. The point had always been this. The warm hand in his, and the sound of children ahead, and the particular quality of the evening light on a woman who had come west with 2 trunks and a surveying map, and had turned out to be, without any doubt or qualification, the whole of what mattered. The creek still ran along the eastern edge of the Crooked Creek property, as it had always run, patient and clear and indifferent to everything except the simple fact of its own passage. And the cottonwoods that Wilhelmina had replanted along its bank had grown tall now, taller than the ones she had found there, and in the fall they went gold and scattered their leaves on the water, and the water carried them south toward Caldwell and past it, out into the wide flat country where everything eventually went. Reuben went to the creek most mornings before the work began, just for a few minutes, standing at the bank in the early light. Sometimes Wilhelmina was there too, having woken early for her own reasons, and they stood together without speaking and watched the water and the light, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of life that most people spent most of their time hoping for, and some people, if they were fortunate and brave and honest with each other, actually managed to build. They had built it out of grief and letters and fraudulent land claims, and a long night ride in courthouse steps, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had come here to make something good out of what her brother had started, and had done exactly that. And they kept building it, year by year, in the way that things worth having are built, through the ordinary accumulation of days that were not remarkable individually, but that meant everything in their gathering, through work and argument and laughter, and the slow, deepening knowledge of another person that comes only from time and honesty and the repeated choice to stay. Through the children who grew and the land that produced, and the neighbors who became family and the letters that kept coming, because Wilhelmina was always writing to someone about something that mattered. She was writing one the evening of their 10th anniversary at the desk in the front room by lamplight, when Reuben came in from the last check of the horses and sat down across from her and watched her write. Her hair was down and she was chewing slightly on the end of her pen, which she did when she was working out an argument, and she was wearing the blue dress that he had always particularly liked. "What are you writing?" he said. "A letter to the Topeka Constitutional Convention," she said, without looking up. "There is a session next month on property rights reform, and I intend to be heard." "You will be heard," he said. She looked up then. "You keep saying that." "You keep proving me right," he said. She smiled at him with the full smile that she did not distribute widely, but that when it landed on you felt like the sun coming out, and she put down her pen and came around the desk and sat beside him and leaned her head on his shoulder. "Happy anniversary," she said. "Happy anniversary," he said. Outside, the Kansas night was clear and deep, and the stars were out in their thousands over the flat land, and the creek ran in the dark, and the cottonwoods stood quiet, and the house held everything it had been built to hold, the warmth and the work and the children sleeping and the two people at the center of it, still choosing each other, still at the heart of the only story that had ever really mattered.